"You will never be accepted here," the border guard spat, "until I show my courage." The dusty road stretched endlessly through the Uruguayan countryside as Theodore Manning adjusted his weathered leather satchel and squinted against the harsh afternoon sun of 1952. The 67-year-old explorer had crossed continents and survived countless adventures, but nothing had prepared him for the cold reception at the small border checkpoint near Tacuarembó. His unconventional appearance, wild gray beard, worn safari jacket, and peculiar walking stick carved from African wood marked him immediately as an outsider in this conservative rural community. Ready to witness a tale of unexpected courage and unlikely friendships in 1950s Uruguay? Hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments which country you'd like us to explore. Next, your engagement helps us bring more incredible stories to life. The guard's weathered face showed nothing but suspicion as he examined Theodore's passport with deliberate slowness. Behind him, the small town of Paso de los Toros shimmered in the heat, its red-tiled roofs and whitewashed walls promising shade and rest that seemed increasingly distant. Theodore had planned to spend only a few days documenting the local gaucho culture before continuing his journey through South America, but the hostility in the man's eyes suggested his stay might be shorter than expected. "What business do you have here, old man?" the guard demanded in heavily accented Spanish. Though Theodore had addressed him in perfect Portuguese, a language he'd mastered during his years exploring Brazil. "I'm a cultural researcher," Theodore replied patiently, switching to Spanish. "I document traditional ways of life before they disappear. I mean no harm to anyone." The guard snorted. "We don't need foreigners telling us about our own culture, especially not strange ones like you." He gestured dismissively at Theodore's unusual attire and the collection of exotic trinkets hanging from his belt, souvenirs from decades of exploration across Africa, Asia, and now South America. A small brown dog with intelligent eyes had been watching the exchange from beneath a nearby cart. As the tension escalated, the creature approached Theodore cautiously, its tail wagging despite the hostile atmosphere. The dog's ribs showed through its thin coat, and a fresh cut on its left ear suggested recent mistreatment. "Even the strays recognize trouble," the guard muttered, raising his boot toward the animal. "Please," Theodore said quickly, kneeling to gently stroke the dog's head. "There's no need for that." The animal pressed against his leg gratefully, and Theodore felt an immediate connection to this fellow outcast. The guard lowered his foot, but his expression remained hard. "You have 3 days. Cause any problems, and you'll find yourself back across the border faster than you can blink. And take that mangy animal with you if you're so fond of it." As Theodore walked into town, the little dog followed at his heels, occasionally looking up at him with what seemed like gratitude. The cobblestone streets were mostly empty in the midday heat, but he could feel curious eyes watching from behind shuttered windows. His joints ached from months of travel, and his left shoulder, injured in a climbing accident in Peru years earlier, throbbed with each step. The single hotel, Casa del Viajero, stood on the main square, opposite a small church whose bells had been calling the faithful to prayer for over a century. The elderly proprietor, Señora Martinez, emerged from behind her wooden counter with the same suspicious expression Theodore had encountered at the border. "We have rooms," she said curtly, "but no animals allowed." Theodore glanced down at his new companion, who had already made himself comfortable on the cool tiles. "He's not mine, Señora. He just ... followed me. Then he can follow you somewhere else." Her tone brooked no argument. The dog seemed to understand and began to retreat, but something in its dejected posture struck Theodore deeply. Throughout his life, he had always been drawn to the underdog, the misunderstood, the rejected. Perhaps it was because he recognized something of himself in them. "Actually," Theodore said firmly, "I think I'll find accommodation elsewhere. Thank you for your time." Señora Martinez shrugged indifferently, but Theodore caught a flicker of surprise in her eyes. Clearly, she hadn't expected him to choose the dog over a comfortable bed. As the afternoon wore on, Theodore discovered that finding alternative lodging proved more challenging than expected. The town had only 3 other boarding houses, and each turned him away with barely concealed hostility. His foreign appearance, combined with his insistence on keeping the dog, made him increasingly unwelcome. By evening, Theodore found himself sitting on a bench in the town square, sharing a simple meal of bread and cheese with his canine companion. The dog, whom he had started calling Campesero, ate gratefully but kept alert eyes on the shadows, as if expecting trouble. "We're quite a pair, aren't we?" Theodore murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. 2 old wanderers nobody wants around. The church bells chimed 8 o'clock, and the square began to empty as families retreated to their homes. Street lamps flickered to life, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. Theodore's back ached from the hard bench, and he wondered if he would spend his first night in Paso de los Toros, sleeping under the stars. Just then, a commotion erupted from the narrow street leading to the river. Shouts echoed off the buildings, followed by a woman's scream. Theodore rose stiffly, every instinct honed by decades of adventure, telling him that somewhere in the darkness, someone needed help. Campesero growled low in his throat, hackles raised, but stayed close to Theodore's side as they moved toward the disturbance. Whatever was happening in those shadows would test not only Theodore's courage, but his determination to prove that sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the most unwelcome arrivals. The screams grew louder as Theodore hurried through the narrow streets, Campesero padding silently beside him. The dog's ears were pricked forward, alert to dangers that Theodore's aging senses might miss. Despite his 67 years and the arthritis that plagued his joints on cold evenings, the old explorer moved with surprising agility through the maze of colonial-era buildings. The commotion led them to the riverbank, where the Rio Negro reflected the moonlight like scattered silver coins. A small crowd had gathered around what appeared to be an overturned cart, its contents spilled across the muddy ground. In the center of the chaos, a young woman knelt beside an elderly man who lay motionless, blood seeping from a gash on his forehead. "Por favor, someone help," she cried in Spanish, her voice breaking with desperation. "They took everything. My grandfather ... I think he's dying." The townspeople stood in a wide circle, murmuring among themselves, but making no move to assist. Theodore recognized the cruel mathematics of small-town politics. Getting involved meant risking association with trouble, and trouble was something these people preferred to observe from a safe distance. "What happened here?" Theodore asked in Spanish, pushing through the crowd despite their unwelcoming glares. The woman looked up, tears streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks. She was perhaps 25, with the calloused hands of someone who worked the land. "Bandits," she whispered. "They robbed our cart. My grandfather tried to stop them, and they ... She gestured helplessly at the unconscious man. Theodore knelt beside the injured man, his experienced hands quickly assessing the situation. During his years of exploration, he had learned basic field medicine out of necessity. There weren't always doctors available in remote corners of the world. The wound looked serious, but not necessarily fatal, though the man's pale complexion and shallow breathing were concerning. "He needs proper medical attention immediately," Theodore announced to the crowd. "Where's the nearest doctor?" "Dr. Herrera lives 2 streets over," someone called out, "but he won't come." "Not for them." Theodore's jaw tightened. "What do you mean, not for them?" The woman's voice was barely audible. We're not from here. We came from the capital looking for work. People think we're troublemakers." The cruel irony wasn't lost on Theodore. Here was another family of outsiders, facing the same prejudice he had encountered. But unlike his situation, there's involved life and death. "Someone needs to fetch the doctor," Theodore said firmly, rising to his feet. "This man could die if he doesn't receive treatment." The crowd shuffled uncomfortably, but no one moved. Finally, a middle-aged man in a shopkeeper's apron spoke up. "Why should we get involved? These people brought trouble with them. First bandits robbed them. Next thing we know, the bandits will be targeting our businesses too. That's exactly the kind of thinking that lets evil flourish, Theodore replied, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen both the best and worst of humanity. When good people do nothing, everyone suffers eventually. Campesero whined softly and nuzzled against Theodore's leg, as if sensing his friend's growing frustration. The dog then did something unexpected. It trotted over to the injured man and began gently licking his hand. The unconscious grandfather stirred slightly, a good sign that he wasn't as far gone as Theodore had feared. "I'll go get the doctor myself," Theodore declared, but the young woman grabbed his arm. "No, sinner. Dr. Herrera. He won't listen to you either. You're a foreigner. He'll just send you away." Theodore studied her face in the moonlight. Despite her youth, her eyes held the weight of someone who had faced rejection and hardship many times before. Her grandfather's breathing grew more labored, and Theodore knew they were running out of time. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Carmen Ruiz, and my grandfather is Eduardo." "Carmen, I'm Theodore Manning, and I promise you this. I won't let your grandfather die because of other people's prejudices." He turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying across the riverbank with the force of moral conviction. "I've traveled to 6 continents and seen humanity at its best and worst. I've watched communities thrive when they support each other, and I've seen them crumble when fear and selfishness take hold. Right now, you have a choice. You can be the kind of people who let an innocent man die because he's different, or you can be the kind who prove that decency still exists in this world." The crowd remained motionless, but Theodore noticed a few faces showing signs of internal conflict. A young boy tugged at his mother's skirt, whispering urgently, but she shushed him with a sharp gesture. "If none of you will help," Theodore continued, "then I'll carry Eduardo to the doctor myself. But I want you to remember this night. I want you to remember that when a stranger showed more compassion for your neighbor than you did, you chose to watch from the sidelines." He began to remove his jacket, preparing to fashion a makeshift stretcher, when a voice spoke from the back of the crowd. "Wait." An elderly man emerged from the shadows, someone Theodore hadn't noticed before. Unlike the others, his clothes showed the wear of honest manual labor, and his weathered hands spoke of decades spent working the land. Campechero's tail wagged slightly, as if the dog sensed something different about this newcomer. "I'm Manuel Santos," the man said quietly. "I'll help you carry Eduardo to Dr. Herrera's house. And if the doctor won't treat him—" He paused, looking directly at the shopkeeper who had spoken against helping. "Well, then we'll all know what kind of man calls himself a healer." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Theodore saw the tide beginning to turn. Sometimes, he reflected, it only took one person willing to step forward to remind others of their better angels. As they carefully lifted Eduardo onto Theodore's jacket, Carmen whispered her gratitude. But Theodore knew the real test was yet to come. Getting the doctor to treat a patient he didn't want to help would require a different kind of courage, the kind that came not from physical strength, but from the determination to do what was right, regardless of the personal cost. The small procession began moving through the dark streets, Campesero leading the way as if he somehow knew the route to salvation. Dr. Herrera's house stood like a fortress of respectability on a tree-lined street, its well-maintained garden and freshly painted shutters a stark contrast to the humble dwellings that surrounded it. Gas lamps illuminated the brass nameplate beside the heavy wooden door, and Theodore could see warm light spilling from the windows of what was obviously a comfortable middle-class home. Manuel Santos rang the bell with determination, while Theodore and another man who had joined their group, a young carpenter named Diego, carefully supported Eduardo between them. Carmen walked alongside, constantly checking her grandfather's breathing and whispering prayers under her breath. Campesero sat alertly by the door, his brown eyes fixed on the entrance as if he too understood the gravity of the situation. After several long minutes, the door opened to reveal a portly man in his 50s, wearing a silk dressing gown over pressed pajamas. Dr. Herrera's immediate expression of annoyance deepened into outright hostility when he recognized the group assembled on his doorstep. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded in Spanish. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" "Doctor, please," Manuel said respectfully, removing his worn hat. "This man has been badly injured in a robbery. He needs immediate medical attention." Dr. Herrera's eyes swept over Eduardo's unconscious form with clinical detachment, then fixed on Theodore with obvious suspicion. "I see we have our foreign agitator involved in this drama. I should have known." Theodore bit back his first response, understanding that losing his temper would only hurt Eduardo's chances. Instead, he spoke with measured calm. "Doctor, I understand you may have concerns about treating unfamiliar patients, but this man's life is in danger. Surely your oath as a physician supersedes any personal reservations." "Don't lecture me about my oath," Dr. Herrera snapped. "I've been practicing medicine in this community for 23 years. I know who belongs here and who doesn't. These people," he gestured dismissively at Carmen and her grandfather, "brought trouble with them. If I start treating every vagrant who gets robbed, where does it end?" Carmen stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "Doctor, we're not vagrants. My grandfather worked as a carpenter in Montevideo for 40 years. We came here looking for honest work, nothing more. Please, he's all the family I have left." "Doctor," Herrera remained unmoved. "That's a touching story, but it doesn't change the facts. I have a responsibility to my regular patients, not to every outsider who shows up with problems." Theodore felt his patience fraying, but before he could speak, a new voice joined the conversation. "Papa, what's happening?" A young woman appeared beside Dr. Herrera, clearly his daughter, with the same soft features, but lacking her father's hardened expression. She was perhaps 30 years old, wearing a simple nightgown with a shawl pulled around her shoulders. Her eyes immediately went to Eduardo's pale, bloodied face. "Maria, go back inside," Dr. Herrera ordered. "This doesn't concern you." But Maria was already studying the injured man with the trained eye of someone familiar with medical emergencies. "Papa, this man has a serious head injury. Look at his pupils. They're unequal. He could have intracranial bleeding." "I said this doesn't concern you." Maria ignored her father and addressed Theodore directly. "How long has he been unconscious?" "About 40 minutes, Theodore replied, hope flickering in his chest. "And he's had these convulsions?" She pointed to Eduardo's left hand, which had begun to tremble slightly. "They started a few minutes ago." Maria turned to her father with firm resolve. "Papa, if we don't operate soon, this man will die. You know I'm right about the symptoms." "Doctor." Herrera's face reddened with anger and embarrassment at being contradicted in front of strangers. "Maria, you are not a doctor. You're a nurse, and barely that. I decide who receives treatment in this house. Then decide like a doctor, not like a politician," she shot back, her voice carrying surprising steel. When did saving lives become conditional on social acceptability? The confrontation might have continued, but Eduardo chose that moment to convulse violently, his body arching despite Theodore and Diego's attempts to keep him stable. Carmen cried out in alarm, and even Dr. Herrera took an involuntary step forward. Campesero, who had been silent throughout the exchange, suddenly began to whine and paw at Eduardo's motionless hand. The dog's distress was so genuine, so heartbreaking, that several of the gathered townspeople, their numbers had grown as word spread, exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Doctor," Theodore said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of all his years and experiences, "I've seen many things in my travels. I've watched communities torn apart by fear and prejudice, and I've seen others strengthened by compassion. Right now, your decision will define not just who you are, but what kind of place this is. Your daughter knows what's right. Your community is watching to see if you'll remember why you became a doctor in the first place." The silence stretched taut as Eduardo's convulsions subsided, leaving him even paler and more still than before. Dr. Herrera looked from his daughter to the crowd, then down at the injured man. For a moment, Theodore saw something crack in his professional facade, perhaps the memory of a younger man who had once sworn to do no harm. Finally, Dr. Herrera stepped aside. "Bring him in," he said gruffly. "But this doesn't mean I approve of any of this." As they carefully carried Eduardo into the house, Maria caught Theodore's arm. "Thank you," she whispered. "Sometimes Papa needs to be reminded of who he used to be." Theodore nodded, but his relief was tempered by realism. Getting Eduardo into the house was only the first step. The real test would come in the hours ahead, when a skilled doctor would need to overcome his prejudices long enough to save a life, and a community would need to decide whether outsiders could ever truly belong. Campesero followed them inside, his loyalty unwavering despite the uncertain welcome that awaited them all. The surgery lasted 3 hours. Theodore sat in Dr. Herrera's waiting room, a modest space filled with medical texts and faded photographs of the doctor's younger, more idealistic days. Campesero lay at his feet, occasionally lifting his head whenever footsteps approached from the direction of the makeshift operating room. Carmen paced by the window, her rosary beads clicking softly as she prayed and whispered Spanish. Outside, a small crowd had gathered despite the late hour. Theodore could hear their murmured conversations through the glass, some expressing concern for Eduardo's condition, others grumbling about the disruption to their quiet town. The carpenter Diego had stayed, along with Manuel Santos and a handful of others who seemed genuinely invested in the outcome. Around midnight, Maria emerged from the back room, exhaustion evident in her posture but relief shining in her eyes. "He's going to live," she announced quietly. Papa removed a blood clot that was pressing on his brain. Eduardo should regain consciousness within the next few hours. Carmen collapsed into a chair, tears of gratitude streaming down her face. "Gracias, Dios mío," she whispered. "Gracias." Dr. Herrera appeared a few minutes later, still wearing his surgical apron, but looking somehow smaller than he had earlier. He avoided Theodore's eyes as he addressed Carmen. "Your grandfather will need to rest here for at least a week. The surgery was successful, but he's not young anymore. Recovery will take time." "Doctor," Carmen began, "we don't have money for. We'll discuss payment later." Dr. Herrera interrupted, though his tone lacked its earlier hostility. "Right now, rest is what matters." As the immediate crisis passed, the waiting room began to empty. Manuel Santos shook Theodore's hand before departing, and Diego promised to check on Eduardo the following day. But it was Maria who lingered longest, obviously wanting to say something to Theodore. "You were right earlier," she said finally, "about communities being defined by how they treat outsiders. I've lived here all my life, and sometimes I forget that our fears can make us lose sight of basic decency." Theodore studied her thoughtful face in the lamplight. "Fear is natural, Maria, but courage is what we choose to do despite our fear. Tonight you chose courage." "No," she replied with a sad smile. "Tonight I just chose to be what I was trained to be, a healer. The courage was yours, coming here as a stranger and refusing to let an innocent man die because of our prejudices." Through the window, Theodore could see the crowd finally dispersing, but he noticed that several people remained in small groups, their conversations appearing more animated and less hostile than before. Perhaps Eduardo's near-death experience had reminded them of their shared humanity. Dr. Herrera re-entered the room, having changed out of his surgical clothes. His demeanor was noticeably different, less defensive, more contemplative. "Mr. Manning," he said formally, "I owe you an apology. My behavior tonight was unprofessional." "You don't owe me anything, Doctor. But you might consider what message your initial refusal sent to your daughter and your community." The older man winced slightly. "Yes, well, perhaps we all learned something tonight." He paused, then added reluctantly, "Maria tells me you have significant field medical experience. If you're planning to stay in the area for a while, I could use an assistant, someone who understands that medicine shouldn't be limited by social boundaries." Theodore was touched by the offer, but shook his head gently. "I appreciate that, Doctor, but I'm a wanderer by nature. I was never meant to stay in one place too long." "But, Senator," Carmen interrupted. "You saved my grandfather's life. How can I ever repay such kindness?" "You don't need to repay anything, Carmen. But I will ask one favor. When you and Eduardo are back on your feet, remember tonight. Remember that strangers aren't always threats, and that sometimes the people who look different from us are the ones who need our help most." As dawn approached, Theodore found himself walking through the quiet streets of Paso de los Toros with Campesero at his side. The town looked different in the soft morning light, less hostile, more like a place where diverse people might actually coexist. At the hotel, Senora Martinez was already awake, preparing for the day's guests. "Senator Manning," she called out as he passed, "I heard about what happened last night. If you still need a room." She glanced down at Campesero, then back at Theodore. "Well, perhaps my no animals policy was too rigid." Theodore smiled, but declined politely. "Thank you, Senora, but I'll be moving on this morning, though I think my friend here might benefit from finding a permanent home with someone who appreciates loyal companions." As if understanding the conversation, Campesero looked up at Theodore with intelligent brown eyes. The dog's tail wagged, but there was something in his expression that suggested he would follow his human friend wherever the road led next. By mid-morning, Theodore had gathered his belongings and was preparing to leave when a small delegation arrived at the town square. Dr. Herrera, Maria, Carmen, and several townspeople had come to see him off. Even the border guard who had been so hostile upon his arrival stood at the back of the group, his expression neutral, but no longer openly antagonistic. "Senator Manning," Manuel Santos spoke for the group, "we want you to know that you're welcome to return to Paso de los Toros any time. What you did last night, ... it reminded us of who we should be." Theodore shouldered his worn satchel and picked up his carved walking stick. The ache in his joints reminded him that he was no longer a young man, but his spirit felt renewed by the events of the past 2 days. "Thank you all," he said simply. "But remember, the courage was already here. Sometimes it just needs someone from the outside to help bring it to light." As he walked toward the edge of town, Campesero trotting faithfully beside him, Theodore reflected on the strange alchemy of human connection. He had arrived as an unwelcome stranger, but he was leaving knowing that he had helped a community rediscover its capacity for compassion. Perhaps that was worth all the prejudice and initial hostility he had faced. The road stretched ahead, leading toward new adventures and unknown destinations. But for the first time in many years, Theodore Manning felt that he was traveling not just as an explorer of places, but as someone who had helped explore the better angels of human nature. Behind him, the church bells of Paso de los Toros chimed the hour, and the sound followed, him like a benediction, as he disappeared into the endless expanse of the Uruguayan countryside. This story reminds us that courage isn't about age or strength. It's about standing up for what's right, even when you're the outsider. If Theodore's journey touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and share this story with others who believe that kindness knows no borders. Your support helps us bring more inspiring tales of human connection to life.